Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. S. Robert Levine. I'm the founder and CEO of the Mary Tyler Moore Vision Initiative. We are the organizers and hosts of this externally led, patient-focused drug development project. Today's webinar is scheduled to last approximately 1 hour. The webinar will be recorded and available for your viewing, after the session on our website, and that's at marytylermoore.org/EL-PFDD. If you want to ask questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and answer as many of those questions as we can before the end of the webinar. But if you have questions that come up or come to mind after the webinar is finished, you can email them to mtmvision drd-pfddinfo@umich.edu. Next slide. I want to, at the top, thank our sponsors, each of Boehringer Ingelheim, Genentech, and Regeneron, which are major biopharmaceutical companies, international in their scale and scope, who are leaders in the field of treatments for developing treatments for diabetic retinal disease. We also have quite a number of supporters of our organization that include University of Michigan's Caswell Diabetes Institute and Kellogg Eye Center, Harvard Medical School's Joslin Diabetes Center, Breakthrough T1D, which is formerly the JDRF, and my family's family charitable foundation, the Mary Tyler Moore and S. Robert Levine, MD Charitable Foundation. We can go to the next slide, please. So just some background on the Mary Tyler Moore Vision Initiative at the start. Next, please. So the Mary Tyler Moore Vision Initiative is a nonprofit organization. We have global collaborations, and we're quite focused, and we're dedicated to accelerating the development of new therapies to preserve vision and restore lost vision in people with diabetes who suffer from diabetic retinal disease. MTM Vision was launched to honor Mary's contributions to diabetes research and help realize her dream of a world without vision loss from diabetes. For those of you who don't know who Mary was a highly successful actress and TV producer and a risk taker who changed the way women are perceived in media and society. And as her second act, she devoted herself to raising awareness of the devastating consequences of diabetes and its complications and the promise of research. In the course of her life, she helped raise billions of dollars to fund diabetes research directly and through her advocacy for U.S. federal support for the programs of the National Institutes of Health. But in the end, diabetes stole her joy because diabetic retinal disease stole her vision. This is an image of Mary at age 40, dancing with Ben Vereen. By age 48, she could no longer dance in this way because she could not see her way safely across a room. And so her wish was, and our wish is, that in the future, people with diabetes will not have to suffer as she had from its complications, including vision loss, that we could in fact save the joy of sight for others. We can go to the next slide, please. So if you look at the scope, the size and scope and urgency, of the problem, you all have a personal connection to this, so you understand this deeply. But every one of the over 550 million people with diabetes in the world is at risk for some form of diabetic retinal disease. The number of people with diabetes is projected to increase to over 1 billion by 2050. And sadly, there's an alarming rate of diabetic retinal disease in youth and young adults with diabetes. In fact, over 50% of individuals with youth onset diabetes have some evidence of diabetic retinal disease by a mean age of 26. Diabetic retinal disease is, in fact, the most common and most feared severe complication of diabetes. And just as to set the table for us all, today, some of you may have never heard the term diabetic retinal disease or diabetic retinopathy or macular edema. These are the effects of diabetes on the retina, which in turn create vision loss for people with diabetes. So we use diabetic retinal disease as an umbrella term for what is many doctors call diabetic retinopathy, which is damage to the blood vessels of the eye. diabetic macular edema, which is swelling under the retina, diabetic retinal neurodegeneration, which is damage to the nerves of the eye, the light-sensitive tissue in the eye. Diabetes can cause hemorrhage behind the eye, of the retina, as well as retinal detachment. So all of those issues are under the umbrella of diabetic retinal disease. And next slide, please. So, overall, our vision is clear. We want to create a world without vision loss from diabetes. Our mission is to accelerate the development of medical products to preserve and restore vision in people with diabetes. We do this by catalyzing breakthroughs, by eliminating barriers to progress, and providing critical resources to the community. And our big purpose is to ensure that people with diabetes can live joyful and independent lives free from the fear and burdens of vision loss. Next slide. We don't have to go into any detail on this, but just understand we have a broad-based strategy of convening the global experts, of developing shareable resources, of bridging gaps to overcome obstacles to progress, and building broad public awareness, all the things that are necessary to eliminate vision loss, from diabetes as an urgent matter. And most importantly, we can go to the next slide. Most importantly, please. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. Most importantly, we listen to the voice of patients in everything that we do. And so this information session today about our ELPFDD, the patient-focused drug development, is really part of that listening. Let's move. We can go to the next. Let's see. Oh, I think I've mentioned this already, but the ELPFDD stands for Externally Led Patient-Focused Drug Development Meeting. The meeting provides a chance for patients, for people living with diabetes and diabetic retinal disease of all sorts, and their families to share their voices and stories with the purpose of accelerating research and improving care. That our ELPFDD will be, if you don't know already, on Thursday, February 12th. This year from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern time. And the QR code is there that will bring you directly to the RSVP form. Importantly, in this, the FDA will be listening in, as will members of the biopharmaceutical community, clinical community, and other experts, as well as other people like you. So let me welcome James Valentine and Sarah Wicks from Hyman Phelps and McNamara, who've been working with us, have been partners with us in planning this important meeting. James has worked, the last 18 years as a champion for the patient voice and part of the regulatory process. He previously worked at the FDA, where he was a patient liaison and helped to incorporate the patient voice into medical product review across all of FDA's various product centers and review divisions. It's there that he helped develop and launch the first of the patient-focused drug development initiatives, of which this is one. Sarah's spent her career helping drug developers and patient organizations navigate novel and complex regulatory issues that emerge during the drug development process. She's especially passionate about ensuring the patient's voice is meaningfully incorporated into product developers and regulators. So James and Sarah together have worked with many organizations like ours to ensure that their community's voices are heard by decision makers. And relevant to our upcoming meeting, they have helped to plan and moderate over 70 of these ELPFDD meetings. So we're in good hands with James and Sarah, and let me turn things over to them.
Well, thank you, Robert, for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, with this community today and talk about this really important opportunity to have your voices, people living with diabetes, at risk of or living with, vision loss and the retinal disease associated with diabetes. It's really important that product developers and the FDA, as Robert mentioned, hear your voices as part of the drug development and review process. And so Sarah, my colleague, and I will be giving you background that will hopefully, whether you're a person who's here on the webinar today, knowing you want to attend this ELPFDD meeting and you're hoping to learn a little bit more, feel more prepared, or maybe if you're, on the line, you're borderline, you're not sure, is this meeting for me? Hopefully by the end of today's webinar, you'll have a good sense of what this meeting is all about. And we of course hope that you'll participate in this externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. We can go to the next slide. What you have show here is a little bit of the background that we want to walk you through that will help give you a sense of what this is all about. The first thing that we're going to do is give you some background on FDA and drug development. This is an important meeting and opportunity for you all to share your experiences because FDA and drug developers want to hear your experiences. What it is that you're living with, what it is that you're worried about in the future, and what your treatment goals and preferences are. So that way they can incorporate that into product development and review. And so in order, it's always good to be, know your audience, so to speak. And so we're going to give you some background on how drugs get developed so you know where your voices fit into that process. And that's exactly what we'll talk about next. We'll give you some background on patient-focused drug development, where your role as people living with diabetes or their care partners and family members, what it is that we're hoping to learn from you and how it fits into the process. We'll get into the details of the meeting itself, how it's organized and structured, the ways you'll be able to participate. And we'll end our talk giving you some, really specific practical information, including on logistics and the format and some tips for participating. So without further ado, we'll get into that first section, giving you some background on FDA and drug development. So we move into that on the next slide. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through the different steps of how products, medical products get developed. Again, because this is important to know where your voice fits into these different steps. And before I start, I think it's important to note that in this context, for this community, we might be talking about products that are targeted at your diabetes more broadly, but in doing so are intended or one of the treatment goals of that therapeutic is to have an impact on the onset and progression of vision loss. But it could also be for more targeted therapeutics. And I know there's a lot of hope and promise, in terms of being able to address the diabetic retinal disease directly. And so, think about it in terms of both of those contexts as we think about products that might come into development. And so the first stage here is drug discovery. So before we ever start researching and progressing through development of new drug, we first have to do basic science research. And so, what does that mean? This is the research that NIH or academic institutions, around the country, around the globe are doing to better understand the disease process. So that way we can know where we might be able to intervene to kind of stop or reverse the effects of the disease. And once we have that better understanding, and of course, this is where medical innovations come into play and give us those new opportunities to try to target a disease process, we can then look to see what different compounds might be possible to have an impact on the disease. And so that might be existing treatments that were developed for other purposes. And that is actually called repurposing of drugs. And there might be new medical advances, new technologies, perhaps even cell and gene therapy to help, in a disease like this, regenerate. And, as those new technologies become available, we can look to see if they might apply to this particular disease process. And so whether it's in a kind of a repurposed drug or a novel product, once we identify those promising compounds, we can then advance them through a well-established path to help make sure they're both safe and effective by the time that they would reach the public. And so in the next slide, what you'll see is once we have that product, if I can draw your attention to the bottom of the slide, you're going to see a number of different phases of actual product development. And this is important because as products get developed, we incrementally build on that knowledge of whether a product is safe and effective. And so the first thing we do before a new product ever goes into clinical trials, gets tested in humans, is called preclinical development. And this is a space where we're doing experiments, either in animals or in other types of laboratory experiments to understand whether the product is reasonably safe for initial use in humans. That's called a toxicology study. But we also want to make sure that the product has the ability to be effective. And we might be able to do that in an animal model of the condition, or in other types of chemical assay and other tests, to see if we're kind of having that target engagement and maybe even some, animal-based efficacy. If we see that information in this setting, and we determine that there's both sufficient efficacy information, it's reasonably safe, and we're looking at this across a number of doses. So we have doses that are reasonably safe. Then that information can be brought and taken to the FDA in what's called an investigational new drug application, referred to in short as an IND. So on the next slide, when that information goes to FDA, it includes the pharmacology, which is those preclinical studies on how the drug's working, the toxicology studies, those are those preclinical studies on the drug safety. But importantly, other information goes to FDA about how the drug is manufactured. In addition to whether a drug works and is safe, there's an important third prong, which is we want to make sure drugs are high quality. We want to make sure that that the product is being produced consistently. We don't want patients to be overdosed or underdosed. We want to ensure that it's high quality and that there aren't impurities that are getting added to products that might be harmful to patients. And so information about that is provided to FDA, as well as the proposed first clinical trial. And so the protocol, which is the study plan, as well as other information that goes to the investigators, which are the study doctors, all gets provided to FDA in that IND submission. And they make then a decision of whether the proposed clinical trial can proceed. Typically, the first clinical trial is called a phase 1 clinical trial. These are very small, very short studies, typically starting with single doses of a drug, going from very low doses, working our way up to higher doses, and then multiple doses, but just a few. Even in a chronic condition like diabetes or diabetic retinal disease, we're still only giving a short duration of treatment, and that's because we're primarily focused on seeing what the drug's most common side effects are. We want to see start characterizing the drug safety profile, and so we go low and slow to do that. We're going to see those most common things, and we want to make sure that the things that are common are not that significant, not that severe in terms of side effects. We also, though, even though we're not looking at the drug's benefit, might get to see, are able to see in this type of study where the drug gets to within the body, how it's metabolized, how it's excreted or it gets removed from the body. And importantly, that's important to know the potential for the drug. Is it in the body, getting to the places we think it needs to get to be effective? Does it stay there long enough to really have the desired effect? And so all of this is examined in phase 1, and assuming things, we identify doses of the drug, again, that are reasonably safe, and have the promise of being effective, we can go into phase 2. So in phase 2, we're now getting to, as you might expect, larger and longer studies. I sometimes refer to these as proof of concept studies, because this is the first time we're really starting to place an emphasis on the drug's effectiveness. One thing that's important is sometimes those phase 1 studies are done in what's called healthy volunteers, people without a particular disease or condition, since we're really just looking at safety. But when we're looking at a drug's effect, we need to know that it works. And so therefore we need to study it in the patient population. And so phase 2 studies are always done in people who have a particular disease or condition or are at risk for a particular disease or condition. Oftentimes, in order to identify that drug effect, we're now adding in placebo controls. Placebos are the so-called sugar pill. This is basically an inactive version of the product. So that way we can see what might be true drug effect versus, what we refer to as the placebo effect. Just from being in a study, sometimes patients experience benefits. While we are starting to look at a drug's effect, we're also looking at short-term side effects and building on our knowledge of the safety. And at the end of phase 2, we want to make sure that there's a reasonable benefit risk profile to proceed into phase 3, which are our largest and longest studies. So on the next slide, you'll see, phase 3 studies. These are sometimes referred to, you might see in the press or, in updates, called pivotal studies or registration studies. These are, the studies that are designed to, be able to determine a drug's true effect. And so these are, because of that, are traditionally large scale, randomized, often placebo-controlled studies. Because these studies are larger and longer, we can start to assess a little bit more about the drug's effect. Not only do we have more ability to detect it, we can detect the duration of the effect by looking at longer exposure, and we can see how the drug maybe affects different subpopulations. When you have a larger study, you have enough people in it that you can start to see maybe how it affects men versus women differently, people at different stages of their progression of their vision loss, so on and so forth. And we may still in phase 3 continue to be evaluating a couple of pared down doses that we're still affecting and trying to identify a dose that is effective but is the most safe for patients. Importantly, because we're, again, larger numbers and longer follow-up, we can continue to assess safety and get more robust safety information. The more people that receive the drug, you can start to see some of the less common side effects. And typically, phase 3 studies resemble a little bit more of a real world population. So we can see potential drug-drug interactions as well. So at the end of this, if we move to our next slide, the idea is, after phase 3, you have typically 2 of those studies to understand what the drug's effect is and have confidence in the drug's effect. But that data and information is taken to FDA, and there's what the goal is to be able to submit a marketing application, which for a small molecule drug is called an NDA or new drug application. For a biological product like a cell or gene therapy, that would be a biologics license application or BLA. And the drug developer will go to FDA and have a pre-NDA or pre-BLA meeting where they're identifying those pivotal phase 3 results, discussing how the results were analyzed or how the data were analyzed to come up with those results. And the goal is to uncover any major result issues, to see whether there's any major gaps in information or issues within the data that would require additional work prior to an NDA or BLA to be submitted. But assuming that kind of the drug developer gets the green light to come in with that application, the NDA or BLA will be submitted to FDA. And it doesn't just include that phase 3 data. It actually includes everything that we've talked about today, all the way from the preclinical information through phase 3. So FDA gets a lot of information that they need to review. On the next slide, it talks about so this is an important place where FDA fits into this whole process because they are the gatekeeper. They make the decision of whether a drug gets approved. And so the first thing FDA does is make sure that the application is complete and assign a review team, assuming that there aren't any gaps in the application. They can start their review. FDA is assessing the things we've already talked about, whether a drug is effective, whether the drug is safe, and safety is that, no drug is perfectly safe. And so it's really, do the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks of the drug? You'll hear us reference that benefit risk decision because that's an important place where your voices will fit into this process. And then, of course, manufacturing quality, where manufacturing process is being scaled up. So that way, if the drug's approved, it can be made available to as many people that are prescribed the drug. And so the new information about that scale up and experience with it is provided to FDA. Importantly, during this process, when FDA is reviewing, FDA can choose to bring the application to an advisory committee. This is a public meeting that they convene with an expert panel. But importantly, in addition to the expert panel weighing in, there's an opportunity for an open public hearing where anyone, including affected individuals, people living with diabetes, families, can speak and have their voices heard as part of the process. So at the end of this, if we go to the next slide, assuming that the drug gets approved, the job of FDA and the drug developer does not stop there. We continue to learn more as the drug is used in the real world, and as that information comes in, it's the responsibility of the drug company to monitor that and report certain safety information. And FDA keeps an eye on this to help make sure that the benefits of drugs continue to outweigh the risks as we learn more about the real world safety profile. So if we go to the next slide. So I've talked a lot about, at the high level, about the process of how drugs get developed. What I'd like to now talk a little bit about is where exactly does FDA fit into that, because we're going to be hearing or speaking to FDA, and you want to make sure that that is understood.
James, may I just come in for just a second to reinforce a few things that you've said? And I would just ask Jocelyn, if you would go back to slide 14 and just remember where we are right now. Since I missed doing this at the very beginning, I want to reinforce what's important about and the purpose of this meeting. James has just done an exceptional job in describing to you all the complexity and of bringing a new drug to market to benefit people with diabetes or diabetic retinal disease. And there's an enormous amount of investment that goes into that process, both on the academic side in developing the basic knowledge, but then on the pharmaceutical side, it's as much as $3 billion to bring a new drug to market. So both doctors and academicians and researchers and pharma companies want to actually know what matters to you, people living with these, disorders, so that they can craft their strategies and develop new drugs that will matter, will make a difference in your lives and can be deployed by clinicians appropriately. So the important purpose of this meeting is for all of us who are not people with diabetes or people with diabetic retinal disease, but who are involved in the creation of new therapeutics, to know what it's like to live with a diabetic retinal disease, know how diabetic retinal disease impacts your life or your loved one's life, know how you or your loved one are currently managing, and what meaningful treatment would look like to you. Those are the essential issues that we all have to understand better in order to be successful as we undertake this long process of therapeutics, an expensive process of therapeutics development. So it's your voices really matter. Can we go to 15? So you are the experts in this, and with regard to our FDA audience, which James is going to talk about, FDA approves treatments based on what they understand from you as being meaningful clinical difference based on the use of those new drugs. So it's really critical for all of us to understand better from you what is meaningful difference to you. What is it you're looking for in a therapy that will prevent the development of diabetic retinal disease and prevent vision loss, or will help you forestall progression of disease, so you can live as full a life as possible. So we can go back to where James was. I just wanted to reinforce that this is a long and complicated process, and in order for us to get it right, we need your voice.
No, that was very well said, Robert, and really appreciate you jumping in there. Even what I just described about the drug development process, it's hard to really say, and put into slides, just, the amount of investment and time that goes into that, and getting it right is so critical. And so, what I want to talk about now is just a little bit about where FDA does and does not fit into that process. So you can see the touch points where, your voice will, impact the process. So just a couple of things to clarify. We talked a lot about, different clinical trials that are conducted. It's important to note that FDA is not the one actually developing drugs. It's researchers, pharmaceutical companies, like Robert just mentioned, that are doing that work. And because they're not developing drugs, they're actually also not the ones that are running those trials. They're not doing the testing. And so, FDA, they're not on site during trials. Again, it's the researchers who are doing those clinical trials, sponsored by typically biopharmaceutical companies. But they do, as I mentioned, need to seek FDA approval at the beginning and before going into any clinical trial. Yeah, I could have across that little um, image I had on the bottom of my slides, put arrows all across it of all the different places that researchers and companies go meet with FDA throughout that process. And so, while FDA is not the one that's doing the testing of those drugs, they do have a lot of influence on what those studies look like, who gets to be included in those studies, what the outcomes measured in those studies will be. And so it's important to know that while they're not doing the studies, they do help direct what that research looks like. On the next slide, it's also important to know that for our audience for this meeting with FDA, that they don't have the ability to regulate the practice of medicine. And what does that mean? They regulate the development of drugs. So they, like I mentioned, have to, have the ability to, have oversight over what clinical trials are conducted and making sure that they're reasonably safe for patients. They also regulate when a product is approved, what a company can say about that product. Those direct to consumer advertisements you see on TV, or when materials are provided to your doctors, that is regulated by FDA. But your doctors, they're free to use FDA approved drugs, within that practice of medicine. And that includes for other conditions, which is known as off-label use. So that's outside of the scope of what FDA has oversight of. They don't really, have much influence over the healthcare system and, what your doctors may or may not know about the condition, or what they choose to use in treating you. Importantly, FDA also does not regulate the price of medicine. They don't have that information. It's not part of their mandate. They're not doing a cost benefit decision. They're doing a benefit risk decision. And so, FDA doesn't have control over what the price of a drug will be, whether an insurance company will cover it or not. And so those types of access issues are also a little bit outside of the scope of what we're focused on with our FDA audience. If you move to the next slide, what I'll say is, while I've mentioned things that FDA is not involved in, they still very much have an important mission of helping promote the public health, not just to protect it. And the reviewers at FDA, I mean, they're involved. They see, the designs and the results of every clinical trial that's being conducted. And so they have so much information and expertise. They've seen what works, they've seen what doesn't work, and they can provide that technical help to researchers and drug developers. They view this as a critical part of their role. It's not just about whether to approve drugs or not. It's to make sure that the studies are done right in the first place, to make sure that we can really interpret those studies. And so they are meeting throughout the entire drug development process. And honestly, your voices are so important, not only at the end of the process when they're deciding whether the benefits outweigh the risks, but throughout in terms of helping to inform how these trials are done, because we want to make sure that studies capture and measure what is important to patients. So if we can move to the next slide, I'll just mention that we've talked a lot about FDA regulation, but we've only really scratched the surface of how drugs get developed and the role that FDA plays. And so if you're interested at all in getting more information, FDA has a great website, fda.gov/patients. Encourage you to dig in as much as you might be interested. But at this point, on the next slide, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Sarah, who's going to talk more about where your voice, the patient voice, fits into this process and give you more information about the PFDD meeting itself. Sarah?
Thanks, James, for that great overview on drug development, which really laid the foundation for why we're having this meeting. And as mentioned earlier, what we're preparing for is an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, or ELPFDD meeting, specifically for diabetic retinal disease. And so, what is the purpose of this meeting? You heard James talk about all of the different steps that FDA takes to review data and clinical studies for the development of new drugs. And germane to that process is the voice of the patient community, the voice of people actually living with the condition and their caregivers. So FDA has developed a systematic way to gather the perspectives of people living with a particular disease and their caregivers living with different conditions. And this information really helps the FDA inform their understanding of the disease so that when they are evaluating clinical trial designs and endpoints and the appropriate patients to be included in studies, that there are representative patients across the disease spectrum, the appropriate endpoints are being studied that really matter to patients, and to also inform the FDA's overall understanding of the context for that benefit risk assessment that FDA was talking about. And ultimately, when a future drug application comes to the FDA for a new drug, that FDA has that voice of the patient during their review of that application. And so I mentioned something called a benefit risk assessment. And so this is a formal assessment that's done by the FDA for every drug that they are reviewing. And the purpose of this assessment is to really decide whether the benefits of a new treatment outweigh the potential risks or the potential side effects of that treatment. And so to understand this, the FDA really needs to analyze what the disease or the condition is and what the current treatments that are available to people living with that condition. So, for instance, are there other FDA approved treatments, or are people just treating the symptoms of their disease because there are no FDA approved treatments for the disease overall? And also, how effective are those currently available treatments? And so this helps the FDA understand the current state of things with respect to that particular disease and available treatments, including what is the unmet medical need for the community. And then as far as the benefits of the treatment and the potential risks, this is the data that James was talking about that they get from clinical trial experience. And so when a company submits all of their data to the FDA evaluates things like what did those clinical studies show? What were the potential side effects observed in those studies? And so the analysis of the condition and the current treatment options, that's where this ELP-FTD meeting that we're going to be having is really going to benefit and help the FDA. And so the meeting that we are currently planning is for the diabetes community. We've been doing um, meeting planning with the support of the FDA to ensure that the topics and questions that we cover during the meeting come from FDA's benefit risk framework, which, as I mentioned, represents important considerations in FDA's decision making. And so as a result of our planning, we've tailored the meeting agenda and panel questions to really try and communicate the most important information related to diabetic retinal disease. And so FDA has emphasized that active patient involvement and participation from the patient community is really the key to the success of these meetings. And so that's why we are having this meeting with you today. And we hope you are as excited about it as we are. And so just to say up front, the big takeaway from this meeting is actually going to be the summary of the meeting itself that's going to be prepared in what we call the voice of the patient report. And that is essentially going to summarize all of the patient and caregiver testimony that is going to be shared throughout the day at the meeting. as well as the polling that we're going to be doing during the meeting, as well as any submitted written comments that are shared not only during the meeting, but before and after the meeting. And this document is really becomes the key communication to the FDA, particularly FDA review staff, when they get a new drug application on their desk, or when they're working with a drug company for a new therapy, designing a study, they can reference this report and really better understand the types of things that are important to this community when making decisions about new therapies. And so FDA really wants this information because it informs ways that meaningful treatments for diabetic retinal disease can be developed. And so now I would just like to discuss the logistics and ways that you can participate in the meeting. So who is this meeting for? It is for everyone with diabetes, at risk for or concerned about vision loss from diabetic retinal disease, people that currently have diabetic retinal disease and their caregivers, as well as bereaved family members. If you've already lost someone from diabetes who had diabetic retinal disease. It's also for FDA staff, as well as pharmaceutical and biotech companies, researchers and other members of academia, and really just anyone that is interested in learning more about diabetic retinal disease. The meeting, as mentioned, is on February 12th, next month from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. It is a virtual meeting, so you can attend from anywhere in the world. We have been talking a lot about the FDA and the United States drug development process, but you don't have to be from the United States to participate in the meeting. We encourage you to participate wherever you are. If you're available for some of the day or all of the day, we would love for you to join us and share your perspectives. It will be a live stream, and so you'll also be able to view the meeting recording at any time. It will be made available at the Mary Tyler Moore website on this slide. And so just a quick overview of the agenda. There will be some introductory comments from the Mary Tyler Moore team, and as well as FDA. The rest of the day is divided into two topics. In the morning, we focus on how diabetic retinal disease symptoms affect you or your loved one's life, or how the fear of vision loss affects you or your loved one's life. And then in the afternoon, we're going to focus on current treatment approaches and clinical trial experience. And so to kick off each session in the morning and the afternoon, we will have quick presentations from diabetic retinal disease experts to provide a clinical overview of the disease, as well as the treatment landscape and what is currently in the development pipeline. And so after each of these presentations, there's an interactive discussion where we'll be starting with pre-recorded statements by people living with diabetic retinal disease and their care partners. There will be polling questions and a moderated discussion with the audience, which is you, where you'll actually be answering questions like, what symptoms do you or your loved one have? Which ones affect you or your loved ones the most? What are you or your loved one's current treatment approaches? And if there was going to be a new treatment, what would it look like? There's going to be some closing summary and some closing remarks. And again, the real meat of the meeting are these interactive discussions. And so we just really encourage you to join us for those and participate. And And I did mention some of the discussion questions that we might be covering during the meeting, but just to give you a little bit more of an idea, for the morning topic, we're going to be focusing on living with diabetic retinal disease. So what are the disease symptoms and daily impacts on you or your loved one's life? And so some of the questions that we'll be asking are, of all the symptoms of DRD, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on you or your loved one's life? How does the fear of vision loss affect you or your loved one's life? What do your best or worst days look like? And are there specific activities that you or your loved one just cannot do at all or as fully as you would like because of diabetic retinal disease? Some additional topics are how you or your loved one's symptoms have changed over time, including how coping with those symptoms might have changed over time. And as I mentioned, what do you fear the most as you or your loved one gets older? As the disease progresses, and what really frustrates you the most about you or your loved one's condition. Topic 2 is going to be focused on current challenges to treating diabetic retinal disease. And so some of the questions that you might be asked on the day of the meeting for in the afternoon session are, what are you or your loved one currently doing to manage diabetic retinal disease? How well do those treatments work to address the most significant symptoms? Are there downsides to those current treatments, such as significant side effects? Is there downtime associated with those treatments, such as with injections or laser surgery? And then also, short of a complete cure, what specific things would you look for in an ideal treatment for diabetic retinal disease? And so to give you an idea on the discussion format, as I mentioned earlier, there will be a panel of patients and caregivers for each topic. These are pre-recorded statements, and the real purpose of these statements is to really provide a foundation for the broader audience discussion that will follow. These panelists have already been selected to reflect a broad range of experience and disease based on where they are at with their diabetic retinal disease journey. We will also have patient and caregivers in the audience that will have a chance to answer polling questions. And this really just gives us an idea of who we have listening and participating, and really gives us a jumping off point for the discussion questions that I just talked about. Which are really just meant to build on the experiences that were shared by the panelists. And so the moderator for the meeting is actually going to be James, together with Robert. And so they will be asking questions and inviting you to speak and share your experiences, whether that's done in writing or we would love if you would call over the phone. And share those comments live so that we can have as much of an interactive discussion as possible. Tips for effective participation. As I mentioned, it is a live meeting, so if you could join us for some or all of the day, that would be fantastic. Keep in mind FDA's role and purpose of the meeting and the topics that are outside of FDA's purview that James had mentioned, such as insurance and access issues. You can review the discussion questions in advance. Those are actually going to be available on the Mary Tyler Moore website, and we'll have that website in a slide or two for your reference. And just know that it's okay to reiterate an experience that someone else has already shared. repetition and creating themes is actually going to be a really important outcome of this meeting, because things that are repeated just provide a signal to the FDA that, hey, this is something that's really important to the community. So don't be afraid to share something, that an experience that's already been shared by someone else. Just give us your perspective of that experience. And we just ask that you keep your comments as concise and focused as possible based on the question that is currently being asked, just because we want to hear from as many of you as possible. And even if you don't feel like sharing the day of the meeting, or if you share and think of something to share later, you can always send in additional comments after the meeting in writing on the Mary Tyler Moore website, and all of those comments will be reflected and captured in the Voice of the Patient report. And so lastly, just to give an overview on the different ways to participate, which I've kind of already alluded to. The meeting is live by webcast. You'll be asked to participate, to vote in some polling questions. We ask that you call in and talk live with us on the day of the meeting, or submit written comments. Please register for the meeting. Registration is open, using the QRC code to take you to the meeting webpage, where you can also find the discussion questions that you can submit comments to ahead of time, and or even after the meeting, up to 30 days. And again, those will all be captured in the Voice of the Patient report. So lastly, just so we have a few minutes for questions, this is your opportunity to be a part of the FDA process and drug development process for bringing new therapies to your community for diabetic retinal disease. You can have a meaningful impact on clinical trial design and drug development. These meetings are very successful in informing the FDA on things that are important when designing studies and approving new treatments. And your voice is needed throughout the entire drug development process, not just at approval. And so we hope you'll join us and to help make a difference for your community. So thank you so much. And at this time, I will open it up for questions if there have been any. So thank you so much.
Great. Well, looks like there's been one question so far, and welcome Robert to come back as well as help answer questions along with us. So one question has come in pertaining to kind of the current climate at HHS and FDA, and some concern about, whether, FDA today, is, kind of has any, prejudices, related to chronic disease, whether, there's any tips to help communicate and share experiences that can help maybe break through any of that might exist. What I can really say to that, and Sarah and I, we are engaged with FDA almost on a daily basis, both through patient voice as well as product development programs. And what I can say is that the kind of review level staff, the people who really their sleeves are rolled up and are the ones, meeting with drug companies and researchers to design trials, are the ones that are making, those benefit risk decisions about products. Those people are still there, and they're working hard, and they are very science based and are still, despite what is happening at kind of like the political level, continue to do really good work. And so what I would say is realize that this is a really unique opportunity to be heard by that level of FDA staff, who are usually, we talked about the huge volume of information that they get. they're very, very busy people, with all these meetings, reviewing all of this data. But they are all, former clinicians and researchers themselves. And so they really value this opportunity to hear from you and cherish it. And they absolutely still take this input into account. And this was going to live, this meeting, while it is for now, it is also a meeting that's going to have an impact for years and years to come. This meeting's recording, the transcript, the voice of the patient report will be referenced by reviewers for years and years to come. So I would just encourage you to maybe not be discouraged by what's going on at the political level and know that this meeting really will still have an impact. So there was another question that came in. The question was, is this meeting focusing on new treatments, or might it be towards improvements that treatments already exist? So we're, seeking input on both. We want to hear about your experiences with existing treatments. And I think we kind of referred to it as some of the downsides of those treatments. And downsides can include not only burdens and side effects, but also limitations in how effective they are. And so, FDA hearing those things will understand, the areas for improvement, whether it's improving those treatments directly or seeing the gaps that can be filled by new treatments. So it really is for both. That was a really good question. Thank you.
Well, James, Sarah, I'm sorry. I mean, it looks like we've hit the top of the hour, and we don't have any open questions. So let me at least, well, we have another. So, yes. So it's Eugenia. I think everyone's voice is important in this context. And as someone who's lived with type 1 diabetes for 30 years and has been spared a diagnosis of diabetic retinal disease, you're not necessarily protected from, downstream impacts. And I imagine, as I've heard from so many people that have long-term disease, there's still concerns about what the future might look like, about new therapeutics that might be utilized to prevent or protect the retina from the effects of diabetes. So your voice is still important about what you hope for the future, what concerns you about your future in terms of the risk of vision loss. All those things have to come into place. And I do also know from the pharmaceutical company perspective, they want to hear from the public that a preventive therapy is desired, in particular by people like you who've lived with the disease for many years. So I guess we can close. If additional questions are welcome, you can enter them at the website, marytylermoore.org/EL-PFDD, and hopefully you'll all register to participate in the virtual PFDD session on February the 12th. Thank you all.
We look forward to hearing from you then.
Thanks, everyone.